Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to a sealed ward beneath the lines of New Antioch, where a soldier marked by the Black Grail is kept alive long after mercy would have burned him clean. There, under prayer, iron, and watchful eyes, a man learns that some souls are not only measured by how they suffer, but by what they can still become. My name is Corin Falkenrath, private soldier, 3rd Line Infantry, St. Cordelia Muster, attached at the time of these events to a burial and clearance detail east of the Pilgrim's Road. It was the year 1914 when they took me below the Lazar House, and I was 27 years old enough to think I understood the look of corruption. I believed the Black Grail announced its work in filth, stink, swollen flesh, and the open mockery of God's image. I believed an infected man looked infected. I believed a clean blade, a hard prayer, and enough lamp oil could keep one danger separate from another. That was before I learned how patient corruption could be. I had not been a soldier long enough to call myself old at war, but I had served long enough to lose the softness that boys bring from farms and streets. Before conscription, I had been a coal miner from Lusasha. It was honest work, black-lunged and brutal, but honest. I knew what it meant to labor underground by bad light, to taste dust in the back of the throat, to trust timber braces you prayed had been set by a careful man, and to feel the earth groan before it gave way. When I was taken into service, I found the army had use for such knowledge. A trench is not a mine, but both teach a man to read pressure, damp, rot, and the ways a buried place tries to kill the living. So I spent my first year with shovel, saw, hammer, and rifle in near equal measure, repairing dugout frames, lining saps, lashing plank walks over wet clay, and trying not to think too hard about the corpses used to firm collapsing parapets when timber ran short. That was New Antioch as I knew it. Pious, cold, exhausted, and never so disgusted by necessity that it would refuse to use it. We were holding a secondary trench line then, a crooked length of earth and revetment half a day's march from the larger fortified roads. The ground there had once been orchard country. You could still find lines of old stone walls under the mud, and when rain cut the banks back, you would uncover roots twisted around shell splinters, saints' medals, and femurs alike. In dry weather, there remained here and there the ghost of straight rows where apple trees had once stood. The old men said that before the wars of doctrine, this district had sent carts of fruit and pressed cider west toward the city markets. By my time, the only harvest worth naming was shrapnel, lice, and men. Still, there were moments at dawn when mist lay low over the broken ground, and the stripped stumps stood in rows like an obedient orchard waiting on a spring that had forgotten us. Those moments made the place feel worse, not better. Ruin is easiest to endure when it is complete. It is the surviving shape of ordinary life that needles at a man. Our trench line had no beauty to it except the ugly beauty of things functioning under strain. Duckboards floated in some stretches and sank in others. Drainage sumps had to be baled by hand after every hard rain. The revetment timber on the east-facing wall had begun to bow, which meant sappers and labor details were forever hammering braces into clay that wanted us buried. Ration tins hung from cords to keep rats out, though the rats learned quickly enough and gnawed through the cords instead. We slept in layers of damp wool and clay smell, and woke to bells, curses, and the long labor of keeping a military wound from collapsing under its own infection. There is a kind of life that grows in such places, hard and joyless, but still recognizably life. Men argue about soup, men carve dice from bone, men mend socks with the seriousness of theologians. Men who have seen artillery chew squads apart will still complain more bitterly about bad boots than about death. That ordinary stubbornness is what lets armies last. I belonged, in those weeks before the bite, to a timber and repair squad folded into the line infantry when the need arose. That meant my days were divided between carpentry, hauling, and brief episodes of terror. At dawn, we checked plank walks, shored door frames, patched dugout roofs, and replaced braces split by ground shift or shell concussion. By noon, we might be carrying ammunition or helping a surgeon's wagon unload bandage crates. At dusk, we went onto the parapet with rifles and convinced ourselves the dark beyond the wire contained fewer things than it truly did. If we were lucky, a day passed in drudgery. If unlucky, drudgery caught fire. The men nearest me were not heroes, which is why I remember them so clearly. Otto Krell, not the Krell Ross already knew in other stories, but a different Otto, a square-faced butcher's son from a river market town, could judge by smell when a support beam had started to take wet rot. Ilias Morn, whose nose had been broken so often it leaned left like a weather vane, sharpened tools with religious intensity and trusted no officer under 30. Burns Sutter carried in his breast pocket a page torn from a devotional pamphlet showing St. Genevieve trampling plague corpses underfoot. He claimed the paper had turned 3 bullets in 2 years, though none of us had seen it do so. At night, if bombardment eased, they spoke not of glory but of roofs, women, sausage, church politics, and whether the quartermaster truly watered the wine or if the vineyards had simply given up on us all. Such talk mattered. A man stays human by friction with other humans. Solitude and holiness are both overrated by those who do not have to sleep beside coughing strangers. The Black Grail had pushed hard in that sector the month before my infection. Not a grand assault with banners and abominations towering over the smoke, but a series of fouler little attacks that veterans feared more. Corpse carts abandoned in the dark. Patients gone missing from a rear aid post. Shells filled not with explosives, but with slurries of filth, bone meal, and living larvae. A breach in one trench, a pit of contaminated water in another. A line of our dead found reassembled on sharpened stakes facing east, each one stitched at the lips with gut string. What changed the mood was not simply the deaths, but the uncertainty of sequence. An artillery barrage kills and is done. A raid wounds and withdraws. Black Grail action left afterthoughts. A trench might hold quiet for 2 days and only on the 3rd produce a man coughing black threads. A burial pile might seem ordinary by morning and by dusk begin to twitch in synchrony as if listening to some underground drum. Even rumors became operational hazards. Men stopped sharing cups. No one slept near the latrine wall after a sentry swore he heard breathing under the planks. A quartermaster mule developed a swelling on one flank and was burned alive before sunset because no officer wished to risk waiting for a veterinary opinion. That was how the Grail fought best, not only through flesh, but through the widening tax of suspicion. I remember one particular evening because it should have warned me how thin the line had become. We were repairing a dugout roof while rain tapped over the tarred canvas and turned the trench into a ribbon of chocolate-colored filth. A burial cart rolled past on the rear track carrying 6 shrouded bodies and a 7th shape under oilcloth too short to be a full man. As it passed, Otto Krell set down his hammer and spat over the side. "You know what the old women in my town said about plague?" he asked. No one answered, so he continued anyway. "They said fever isn't the danger. Fever is just the knock on the door. The danger is that once a house learns to expect sickness, it starts making room for it." Ilias laughed at him and said butchers should stick to sausages, not philosophy. But the remark stayed with me. Our line had started making room. For extra ash pits, for sealed barrels, for confinement drills, for the possibility that a wounded friend might need a hook through the neck and a prayer rather than a stretcher. Once an army makes such space in itself, every ordinary task changes shape around the absence. That, I think now, was already part of the infection before any tooth touched my hand. By the time I joined burial and clearance, the worst of the fighting had passed. That made the work no cleaner. After Black Grail contact, there were rules, and if men grumbled at them, they still obeyed. Burn what can be burned, salt what cannot. Mark suspicious tissue with red cloth and do not cut deeper than ordered. Remove teeth from the dead only if commanded by a priest surgeon. Search pockets with hooks, not fingers. Never scrape rot bare-handed from iron or leather. Never open a sealed jaw. Never assume a still body is empty. If a corpse swells after sunset, burn the whole stack, and everyone handling it must wash in ash and vinegar before entering a sleeping dugout again. The instructions were so common that they became litany. Men repeated them while smoking, while hauling stretchers, while stirring cookpots. Most of us treated them the way men treat every rule designed to save them from a death they have not personally seen. We obeyed, but with the half-contempt of soldiers who think every danger is magnified by priests to keep discipline firm. I was no different. There were 6 of us on the clearance detail the morning I believe I was marked. Sergeant Halber had charge. He was a thick-necked veteran with frost-burned scars along his ears and a habit of tapping each tool against his boot before use, as if counting them by touch. He said little, cursed rarely, and believed no order had been understood unless it had been repeated back to him. With us were 2 labor brothers from the trenches of St. Barakiel, both older men, both better at hard work than prayer, though they prayed enough when anyone important watched. There was Mikeldorn, who had been a ferryman on the River Chale before the war, and still walked like a man compensating for current underfoot. There was young Pavo, whose whiskers came in one cheek at a time, and who had the unwise confidence of someone not yet punished by survival. There was Sister Eudocia of the Hospitallers, there to identify what needed holy handling, and a one-eyed artilleryman named Bryn serving temporary punishment detail after striking an officer in a ration dispute. We went out at dawn with hooks, wrapped faces, blessed oil, 3 handcarts, 2 drums of accelerant, and a writ bearing the seal that allowed us to cross into ground not yet fully cleared of contamination. The morning was wet enough that the smoke from our cook trench lay flat along the earth. Bells from the rear chapel carried weakly over the line. Somewhere farther south a bombardment was going on, but at our distance the guns spoke like weather. The place we were sent was less a battlefield than a wound left open. A communication trench had collapsed under shelling and then been overrun, retaken, overrun again, and finally abandoned after reports of Black Grail contamination among the fallen. Corpses had lain there 3 days. That was too long in normal weather. After Black Grail action, it was an invitation to every form of blasphemy flesh could invent. Even before we entered the collapsed section, we saw the signs Sister Eudocia warned us to note. Flies, too many for the season. Cloth darkened in patches that spread against the grain, as though damp rose through fabric from within rather than without. A mule carcass 20 yards off, bloated but not pecked by birds. And along the trench lip, in mud softened by rain, a set of prints like boot marks made by someone who weighed far too much for his size. "No heroics," Halber said. "We hook, haul, burn, salt, and go. If it twitches, call. If it talks, run." Pavo laughed because he thought he should. No one joined him. The trench was shallow where the shelling had torn it in, deeper farther along where surviving timber had held. Mud had swallowed men by the legs where they fell. In some places only hands or backs were visible. In others the dead had lain atop one another, pressed into corners by blast and collapse. The smell was almost ordinary at first: wet earth, burst bowels, spoiled cloth, burnt powder, old blood. Then underneath it came the sweet cloying note I learned later to dread more than open rot. Not decay. Not exactly. Something like meat kept warm too long and fed with sugar. Sister Eudocia stopped twice to mark bodies with her wand of charcoal and salt. Those were not for us to move at once. The first lacked a lower jaw, but had no corresponding blood loss in the mud. The second had fingers fused together under the skin, as if the hand had tried to grow into a paddle. She murmured prayers I did not know, and tied red cloth to their wrists. "Leave them for the surgeons," she said. Halber spat. "If surgeons wanted this ground, they'd be here." "Leave them," she repeated, and Halber, who feared sisters more wisely than lieutenants, obeyed. We worked for 2 hours in the miserable rhythm all such details share. Hook, pull, cut free, search for tags, stack, cart, burn. When the dead were mostly intact, it was simple labor. When they were not, it became craft. You learned how cloth bore weight when flesh failed under it. You learned how to lift by webbing, by belts, by the strap beneath a shoulder blade. You learned to ignore faces. I had seen enough dead by then that my disgust had become selective. Men I knew could still trouble me. Men reduced to matter usually did not. That too was a corruption of war, though a lawful one. At mid-morning we reached the back bend of the trench, where a half-sheltered dugout entrance yawned black beneath shattered planks. A cluster of bodies blocked it. Not ours, not all of them. Some wore the patched remnants of new Antioch coats. Some had rags wrapped over armor, devotional cords knotted together with teeth and copper charms, and the gray-brown bloom upon the skin that men said marked those who had supped from the Grail's contagion without yet falling fully apart. One body sat upright against the jamb as if resting. Its helmet had been removed. The scalp beneath was shaved and tattooed with a chalice worked in concentric lines, as though it had been cut there with a hot needle again and again. Before we touched them, Sister Eudocia made us stand off while she performed the little field rite used when Black Grail contamination was suspected but not confirmed. It was a practical ceremony stripped of grandeur by repetition. She took a strip of white cloth from her satchel, dipped 2 fingers in sanctified oil, marked the cloth with a cross, and tied it over the lower half of her face. Then she walked the cluster sunwise, or as near sunwise as a trench bend permitted, tapping each corpse once on brow or breast with the charcoal wand while murmuring phrases too soft for me to catch. The point, she later told me, was not that the dead required courtesy. The point was that the living required rhythm. Men do worse work when they feel they are rummaging. A rite turns handling into duty. While she moved, Pavo whispered beside me, asking whether it was true the Black Grail could pass by gaze alone if the victim met a contaminated corpse eye to eye. Bryn heard him and snorted. "If that were true, we'd all be dead by breakfast." Mikkel Dorn said without turning his head that there were older stories from the river provinces of plague saints who kept disease in their teeth and passed it with a smile. Halber told all 3 to shut up, but I remember the exchange because it shows how war breeds an ecology of belief. Formal doctrine, trench superstition, village lore, professional cynicism. They all lived side by side in us, and each would step forward depending on which danger a man hoped to understand. The seated corpse troubled me more the longer I studied it, not because it was visibly moving then, but because it had the look of something arranged rather than fallen. Mud had dried in a fan around its boots, as if it had been seated before the last rain and not shifted since. The chalice tattoo on the scalp was not crude gang work. It had precision. Rings within rings, each line equidistant, the sort of patient marking impossible in the middle of combat. There were also small hooked scars behind both ears and at the hinge of the jaw, neat paired incisions almost hidden by grime. Sister Eudocia later said she thought such marks indicated prior feeding, draining, or some kind of devotional surgery. At the time, I only knew that the body looked prepared. A little farther off lay one of ours with both hands wrapped in rosary cord so tightly the fingers had gone blue-black. Byrne Sutter, who had been transferred to another sector 2 days before, else he might have been with us there, would have said at once that the man had tied himself against unclean urges. I thought instead that someone else had bound him after death. The cords had cut deeply enough to expose tendon. Yet the hands were otherwise untouched by scavengers. Even flies avoided them. Such details accumulate. A battlefield contaminated by ordinary rot feels random. Black Grail ground feels curated. Bryn nudged it with his hook. The head rolled aside on a neck too soft to hold it. Pavo swore and crossed himself. "Cart them," Halber said. Sister Eudocia bent, studied the seated corpse, and drew a line of ash across its brow. "Watch the wounds," she said quietly. "This one fed others." I remember that because I thought it melodramatic at the time. Fed others. I pictured vermin. I pictured infection moving through open blood. I did not yet understand how often Black Grail language was more literal than anyone wanted. We cleared enough of the bodies to expose the dugout steps. The air rising from below was warmer than the trench air above. That was wrong at once. Dugouts kept temperature. They did not breathe. Halber ordered lanterns lit. Mine smoked because the wick had gone damp. I trimmed it with my knife, relit it, and followed him down with Mikkel at my shoulder. There were 4 bodies inside, and one of them should not have been alive. The dugout had partly collapsed at the rear, making a low cave of dirt, timber, and smashed shelving. The first 3 dead were plain enough, our men, stiff, gray, already slackening at the jaw. The 4th lay wedged beneath a fallen beam in a Black Grail coat stitched with strips of human skin, still wet-looking despite the days since battle. Its chest moved so faintly I thought at first the lantern flame was playing tricks. Then it opened its eyes. I have tried since then to decide whether there was intelligence in that look. I think there was, though not humanly arranged. One eye had gone milky. The other was clear and bright as a fever patient. It fixed on me, not Halber, though Halber stood nearest. Its lips were cracked. Something dark lined the gums. "Water," it whispered. No one moved. Sister Eudocia, still above, called down for a report. Halber did not answer. The thing under the beam inhaled again, a wet, careful breath. I remember seeing that one hand was trapped beneath the timber, fingers crushed flat. They should have been black or pulped. Instead, the flesh around them looked newly formed, glossy, tender, and somehow eager. "Water," it said again. That was when Bryn, from the top of the steps, muttered, "Burn the hole." He was right. Every rule said so. A living, contaminated enemy found after battle, trapped in enclosed ground, was not a prisoner. He was fuel. But rules are easiest when they meet shapes we recognize. This one looked almost pitiable, starved, broken. Its voice, though foul, had been a man's voice, and pity is the weakness by which many doors are opened. I had a canteen in my left hand. I had been drinking from it all morning. Before Halber could stop me, I crouched, uncorked it, and tipped a little water toward the thing's mouth. It moved faster than anything that wounded should have moved. Not the whole body, only the head and shoulders. It lunged enough to catch my wrist in both hands and pull. I felt its teeth scrape the heel of my thumb through the glove where old stitching had worn thin. Not a proper bite, more a desperate rasp. Its mouth was hotter than any fever. I struck it with the canteen and yanked free. Halber brought his hook down across its face with a crack of bone. Mikkel swore. The lantern nearly went over. The thing thrashed once under the beam, more in appetite than strength, then sagged back, breathing in thin whistles. When I pulled my hand away, the glove was torn. There was a red crescent below the thumb joint, shallow as a kitchen nick. Sister Eudocia came down, saw the wound, and slapped me hard enough to ring my ears. "Idiot," she said, which was fair. What followed should have saved me if salvation were merely procedure. They doused the creature in oil and burned it where it lay. The smoke from its flesh was green-black and thick enough to make our eyes run through cloth wrappings. Sister Eudocia cut away my glove, lanced the wound to encourage bleeding, packed it with salt, vinegar, and ash from her own prayer brazier, then bound it in waxed linen marked with ink sigils. She made me repeat 3 denunciations against the Grail, then had me swallow a mouthful of bitter tincture that made my gut cramp before noon. "You'll report to triage after shift," Halber said. "It's a scratch," I said. Again, Sister Eudocia slapped me. She seemed to find repetition calming. We finished the clearance. I burned bodies with my left hand and pulled carts with my right. The wound stung, bled a little through the bandage, then stopped. By the time we returned to the line, the flesh around it felt numb and oddly tight, as if a strip of skin had been glued over living meat before it was ready. At triage, they made me undress, recorded the bite, the source, the exact hour, the method of cleansing, and whether I had experienced nausea, trembling, intrusive thoughts, unusual appetite, or auditory disturbance. I answered no to everything because I felt stupid and wanted back to duty. The surgeon there, Brother Medic Ansel, did not look impressed. He was a small, bald man with wrists like cable and a habit of sniffing before speaking, as if people were food he did not trust. He peeled back the dressing and frowned. "It is already knitting," he said. "Good," I answered. He looked at me over the rims of his spectacles. "No, Private Falconwrath. Not good. Interesting." Those are different words. I know that now. He sent for a priest. They questioned me again. I repeated the facts. The wound was washed once more, this time with water so hot I thought they meant to boil the hand off me. They painted the skin around it with iodine, ash, and some clear oil that smelled like cloves and funerals. Then they put me in a mule cart with 2 orderlies and sent me rearward under seal, my transfer chit marked with a black line that caused every checkpoint to wave us through without further inspection. I spent that journey telling myself I had been singled out only because the church was thorough. New Antioch could be cruel, but its cruelty often came from bureaucracy before malice. If there was a prescribed place for men touched by Black Grail matter, then to that place I was going. I imagined a ward with other scratched fools, a week under observation, perhaps a lecture from a confessor, then return to service with a scar and a tale about my own stupidity. I should have known better from the silence of the orderlies. Men who escort the recoverable complain. Men who escort the condemned avoid attachment. The Lazar House stood beneath a ruined monastery 2 miles west of the active line, built into an old crypt whose upper stones had been reinforced with fresh concrete and sanctified iron. From outside it looked like a shelled chapel and 3 low outbuildings behind coiled wire. Once, perhaps, it had been a place of learning or patient contemplation. You could still see fragments of carved vine work around one upper arch and the worn feet of a saint on a plinth whose torso had been shelled away. Now everything above ground was functional ugliness. Drainage trenches, screened burn pits, canvas partitions stiff with weather, orderlies moving stretchers under armed watch. The wounded went into the upper wards. I did not. They took me through a side door below a carving of St. Alban offering his own flesh to the birds, down 2 flights of narrow stone stairs, and into air that smelled of lamp oil, wet linen, old incense, blood, lye, and the sour, rank sweetness I had first noticed in the collapsed trench. That descent remains with me more vividly than some battles. On the first stair the air still held the ordinary misery of war medicine. Boiled bandages, unwashed bodies, fear, opiates, old stone. On the second it changed. Cooler at first, then denser, as if the corridor itself did not want to exhale. Lamps burned behind wire cages in the walls, their light flattened by whitewash and damp. Every few steps there stood a small niche containing a saint's image or relic case, not for devotion alone, I think now, but as layered reinforcement, a spiritual version of extra lock plates and braces. We passed one door behind which a man was screaming in a high animal pitch that made the escort orderlies look studiously at the floor. We passed another from which came a woman's calm voice reciting a litany against pestilence, line after line, without pause, as though the prayer itself were serving as bandage or restraint. At a landing between levels I saw, through a partly open service door, a chamber lined with shelves of labeled jars and sealed boxes, bones, tissue, tools, ledger cases wrapped in oilcloth. The sight lasted only a second before the door shut, but it altered my understanding. Hospitals store medicines. Workshops store materials. Archives store lessons. Whatever lay under St. Alban was all 3 at once. There, at last, I understood I had not been sent for treatment in any ordinary sense. The intake chamber was whitewashed stone under a barrel vault blackened with candle soot. 2 nuns in waxed aprons cut away my uniform while a clerk recorded every item removed from my person. Rifle tag, paychit, rosary, boot knife, tobacco pouch, 1 walnut, 2 nails, 1 Cooper's awl. I had no business carrying off detail. My clothes were dropped into a brazier and burned in front of me. They shaved my head, chest, groin, and arms. They clipped my nails so close the quick bled. They bathed me in water steeped with ash and bitter herbs until my skin went red and tender. They scrubbed the bite until it reopened, and I flinched not because of the pain, but because I no longer felt pain there in the proper way. Pressure, yes. Heat, yes. But the raw, central hurt of a wound belonged already to somewhere deeper. "Name," said the clerk. "Private Corin Falkenrath." "Unit," I told him. "Religious status." "Communicant in good standing. Confirmed. No disciplinary censure." "Night terrors?" "No more than usual." He looked up for the first time. "Do not be clever here." "No," I said. "Appetite?" I thought of the noon ration I had devoured half an hour earlier, and the way my stomach already wanted more. "Normal." A priest in a dark leather apron stepped into view beside the clerk. He was not old, but pallor and long confinement had made him look carved from candle wax. The tonsure on his scalp was precise as geometry. His hands were surgeon's hands, clean and square at the fingers. He introduced himself as Father Examiner Lucerne. His voice was kind enough that I distrusted it instantly. "Private Falkenrath," he said, "you have been exposed to an agent associated with Black Grail contagion. We will observe, test, and, if God allows, preserve you. You will obey every instruction immediately. You will speak truthfully. If your condition progresses, we will measure that progression. If it does not, we will still measure. Do you understand?" "Am I dying, Father?" "All men are dying," he said almost gently. "We are concerned here with rate and destination." That was my welcome. My cell lay in the 3rd corridor below intake, behind a door faced with iron lattice over oak so thickly banded it looked built for artillery. There was a small inspection hatch at eye level, a slot for trays, a vent high in the wall, and inside a narrow cot, a stool fixed to the floor, a bucket, a wash basin chained by its handle, and a crucifix bolted above the bed. The walls had once been dressed stone, but much of the surface was hidden beneath white lime wash painted over old scratched prayers and newer identification marks. Mine read in black ink beside the door: Ward C, Cell 4. Contact oral, blood day, 0, subject conscious. Subject, not patient. That sat poorly at once. What unsettled me nearly as much were the traces of previous occupants. Whitewash hides but does not erase. In the lower corner near the cot, someone had scratched a sequence of little vertical lines, grouped by 5, then smeared them out with a thumbnail as if counting had become unbearable. Beside the door, under the fresh notation, old words showed through where the lime had gone thin. Delay is cruelty. I could not tell whether that had been written by staff or prisoner, and the uncertainty gnawed. Beneath the vent, another hand had carved a tiny fish symbol, then gouged through it repeatedly until the shape became a scar in the stone. The bucket bracket had older corrosion around its screws. Proof that I was not the first to trouble metal in that room, though perhaps not in the same manner. Every mark suggested precedent. Precedent is a comfort in most human institutions. In a quarantine crypt, it is poison. I asked the nun escorting me whether there were many others below. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "You are not the worst case." Then she closed the door. The first hours alone in that cell were almost peaceful, which made them sinister in retrospect. Above ground, war is noise, interruption, pressure. Alone underground, with the door sealed and the lamp fixed beyond my control, I had too much room to think. I inventoried the cell 3 times, counted cracks, tested the bucket handle, the cot frame, the mortar joints near the floor. I recited the order of my detail from that morning to ensure I still could. Halber, Dorn, Pavo, Eudocia, Bryn, myself. I pictured the trench bend, the seated corpse, the lunge, the scrape of its teeth against the glove seam. Each revisit made the memory less like something completed and more like something still happening at a distance I might yet close. Ward C, Cell 4. Contact oral. Blood day. 0. Subject conscious. Subject. Not patient. That sat poorly at once. I asked the nun escorting me whether there were many others below. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "You are not the worst case." Then she closed the door. Ward C, Cell 4. Contact oral. Blood day 0. Subject conscious. Subject. Not patient. That sat poorly at once. I asked the nun escorting me whether there were many others below. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "You are not the worst case." Then she closed the door. The first day passed in examinations. Father Lucerne returned with brother medic Ansel and a younger clerk who smelled of fresh parchment. They took blood from both arms. They collected saliva, skin scrapings, urine, stool. They measured the wound. They pressed the flesh around it with silver, then with iron, then with a relic case containing a bone splinter of some martyr whose name I was too angry to remember. They asked whether I heard voices, whether I desired raw meat, whether I felt revulsion at Scripture, whether I remembered my mother clearly, whether I had ever dreamt of eating earth, whether I had witnessed any Black Grail rites in the field, whether the infected enemy had said anything beyond asking for water. The questions came in sets, and the sets repeated with tiny changes that told me more than the words themselves. One round dealt with appetite, cooked flesh, uncooked flesh, marrow, blood, dairy, wine, lamp oil, candle wax. Another dealt with aversion, bells, icons, relics, incense, cold iron, prayer sung by one voice versus prayer sung by many. A third dealt with selfhood in a manner so clinical it might have been blasphemous if uttered by anyone less sanctioned. Did I still experience shame? Did I distinguish memory from desire? If I pictured my mother's face, did hunger interrupt the image? If I imagined the man who had bitten me, did I feel kinship, disgust, or curiosity? It was then I understood the ward did not merely fear contamination in the usual way. They feared gradations. They were searching for the point at which a man became strategically dangerous rather than simply doomed. Ansel performed the physical parts with the brisk irritation of a craftsman forced into paperwork. Lucerne watched. The clerk wrote. More than once I caught them speaking over my body as barrel makers speak over timber stock. "Capillary refill abnormal but not necrotic," Ansel said. "Record color shift under pressure," said Lucerne. "Thermal variance at wound margin. Record it." At one point, Lucerne asked the clerk to note my pupils after reciting a prayer against contagion. He spoke the prayer in a low monotone while I sat stripped to the waist on the stool. I listened because I had no choice. At the second invocation, a pulse of irritation moved through me so fierce I nearly told him to stop. At the third, irritation became something more primitive, like the urge to strike a buzzing insect from one's ear. Lucerne's eyes sharpened. He had seen the change before I understood it myself. "Again," he said. I obeyed until the fourth repetition, when I spat at the floor between his boots. Silence followed. Not shocked silence. Confirming silence. Ansel struck me across the mouth with an open hand. Blood filled my lip. I expected rebuke from Lucerne, perhaps a warning against damaging the subject. Instead, he crouched to inspect the blood on the stone. "How does that taste?" he asked. It was such an obscene question that I laughed despite the pain. Then, because the world had already begun to tilt, I answered honestly, "Not wrong enough." The clerk's pen scratched like a rat. "He spoke like a man," I said. "Anne." "That is not what I asked," Lucerne replied. I tried a soldier's sarcasm. "Would you like me to invent blasphemy to improve the notes?" Ansel slapped the back of my head hard enough to blur my sight. "You are here because a thing touched by the Grail put its mouth on you," he said. "You will not try to amuse yourself at our expense." After that, I answered plainly. They fed me boiled barley, salted greens, black bread, and weak broth. I ate everything and remained hungry enough to shame myself, asking whether there was more. The nun who brought the second bowl crossed herself before handing it through the slot. That night I heard the others, not screams at first, coughing, someone praying in a whisper too fast to be pious, a chain dragging once over stone. Farther off, one long, low sound that might have been a man in pain or an animal keeping itself quiet. The ward was not large, perhaps a loop of corridors and side chambers, but stone altered distance. Voices arrived, cropped, directionless. More than once, I stood under the vent, convinced I could sense movement beyond hearing, as if the air itself carried the awareness of nearby warm bodies. I slept badly. In my dream, I was back at the cooper's yard, fitting iron hoops to a cask. Each hoop swelled with rust under my hammer, not crumbling but blooming thicker, like fungus fed on metal. When I looked into the cask, it was full of dark broth in which teeth floated upright like seeds. I woke with my mouth flooded in saliva, and my hand clamped so hard around the crucifix above the bed that the base had cut my palm. The cut should have bled. It did not. It sealed while I watched. Morning examination found the bite nearly closed. That should have been impossible. The torn crescent beneath my thumb had become a pale, glossy seam, not scar tissue. Scar tissue puckers, pulls, reminds a man that something was damaged. This looked as if the flesh had been rewritten from inside by something that knew the shape of a hand, but not its proper textures. The skin there was smoother than the rest, stretched fine over fullness that had not been present the day before. Ansel pressed it with his thumb. Any pain? Not much. Any numbness? Not exactly. He glanced up. Then what exactly? I searched for the truth and hated it. It feels aware. That earned a quick note from the clerk. The days settled into routine, and routine is what made the place dreadful. If they had beaten me, threatened me, or shouted, it would have been easier to sort the ward among the ordinary cruelties of war. Instead, they were orderly. Bells rang at fixed hours, lamps were trimmed by rule, floors were washed twice daily with lye and blessed water, meals came at the same times, examinations followed a schedule marked somewhere beyond my sight. Even the prayers were regulated, morning litany, midday intercession, evening purification, night silence broken only for emergency rites. New Antioch excelled at making damnation procedural. After 3 days, I knew the ward's clockwork almost as well as the staff. Before dawn came the wash round and the first check of respiration, lucidity, and restraints. At first light, trays arrived with hot water, barley, and black bread, followed by inspection for night changes, new lesions, altered speech, blood in the saliva, scratching at walls, attempted self-mutilation, prayers spoken backward, all the little milestones by which a man was translated from concern to case. Mid-morning belonged to samples and tests. Noon brought the corridor sermon, always short, always delivered by a different priest, perhaps so no one voice became associated too strongly with pity. Afternoon was worst. Long intervals for the mind to pace itself raw between noises. Evening brought purification prayers, food, and whatever interviews Lucerne thought the day had earned. Night was supposedly silence. In truth, it was the ward's most truthful hour. For silence below, St. Alban was never silence. Stone carried too much. Water moved somewhere within the walls like someone shifting beneath blankets. Chains answered one another in distant metallic syllables. Men muttered in sleep, sobbed in waking, vomited, coughed, pleaded, denied, promised impossible devotions if only the pain would end. More than once I woke to hear a priest speaking steadily through some other door, guiding an unseen patient through final confession with the practiced gentleness of a man mending a seam he knows will not hold. There were also sounds no one acknowledged at breakfast. Wet impacts, a kind of dragging suck from farther corridors, once a long choral murmur from many voices that ceased the moment a bell rang. The ward taught by omission as much as by statement. If no one explained, a man was left to build his own horrors, and self-built horrors are always tailored well. I tried at first to preserve ordinary habits. I folded the blanket square when rising. I washed before each meal. I counted prayers on the rosary of memory when the physical beads had been taken. I recited Cooper's measurements under my breath because numbers felt less perishable than faith. For a while this helped. A man who keeps ritual for himself can pretend he remains his own keeper. But the ward had rituals too, and theirs were stronger because they controlled matter. When they opened the slot, I ate. When they closed the hatch, I waited. When they called, I answered or paid for silence. Gradually, my private order became a little shelf inside theirs. By the third day, Father Lucerne had adjusted his manner with me. Not warmer, more invested. He began asking longer questions, not merely about symptoms, but about thoughts. "When you smell blood now," he asked through the hatch one morning, "what do you feel first?" "I don't smell blood now." He waited. That was his talent, silence as leverage. At last I said, "Heat." "From the blood?" "From the body it is in." He noted that. "And does the heat repel or attract?" I said nothing. "Private Falkenrath." "Attract." He wrote longer at that. On day 4, they moved another subject into the cell opposite mine, though I never saw him directly then. I knew because men came with chains. There was a smell like opened graves, and for the first time I heard outright pleading. "No more dark," a voice said hoarsely. "By the mercy, not dark again." A second voice, calm and professional, answered, "Then remain calm, and the lamp will stay." The pleading became weeping, then muttering. Later, through the vent, I heard that same man reciting the names of apostles in the wrong order again and again, as if trying keys in a lock. That night, I asked the ward sister who brought my food how long men remained below. She was not one of the hard-faced nuns from intake. She was older, broad at the shoulders, with red cracks in the skin of her hands from constant washing. Her name tag identified her as Sister Malin. She had a way of setting trays down as if the person behind the slot were still a person. Small difference, immense effect. "Depends on the case," she said. "Has anyone left cured?" She held my gaze a heartbeat too long. "Eat while it is hot." That was answer enough. My appetite worsened. They increased portions twice. Bread no longer interested me much. Grease did. Broth thick with animal fat did. When once a sliver of boiled liver appeared in the evening ration, the smell of it hit me before the tray reached the slot, and I nearly took Sister Malin's hand with the bowl from sheer reflex. I stopped in time. She noticed. She said nothing. Neither did I. Shame works hardest in silence. There were gradations to the hunger, and documenting them now may do more good than modesty. Ordinary hunger sits in the gut and complains upward. This sat everywhere. The tongue anticipated before the nose finished confirming. The palms tingled when warm food neared. The jaw muscles tightened of their own accord at certain scents, not merely meat, but opened flesh, fresh blood, even the copper tang left on a cloth after someone nicked a finger. Worse, satiation had become brief and strangely local. A bowl of broth calmed the stomach but not the mouth. Fat quieted the teeth but sharpened the restlessness in the bitten hand. Salt helped for an hour. Prayer helped less. There were moments after eating when I felt not full but insulted, as if my body recognized the ration as technically correct and spiritually inadequate. I began to dread the smell of the orderlies themselves, not because they were foul, though most hospital workers carry that blend of soap and human fatigue unique to the trade, but because every passing person now arrived surrounded by details the body should not crave. The warmth behind knees, the pulse at the wrist where a sleeve had ridden back, the blood heat in the neck under damp hair. When no one was nearby, the hunger grew abstract and therefore manageable. When someone approached the slot, it became intimate, almost conversational. That is the only word for it. The body entered negotiations with me. Just this. Just once. Just enough to quiet the ache. I would clench my hands until the nails bit skin and repeat the names of saints like a man arguing with a debtor. On day 5, they allowed Father Lucerne to bring a chair into the cell and sit with me for a full interview. This, I understood later, was not kindness, but confidence. 2 guards remained outside the door. My wrists were bound to rings fixed at the head of the bed. Still, the gesture of proximity mattered. It meant they believed me manageable. "Tell me about your childhood," he said. I laughed because I could not help it. "Is that in the manual?" "Infection traces memory. Corruption often rearranges devotion through the seams of the self. Begin with your father." So I did. What choice had I? I told him about the cooper's yard, the noise of mallets on hoops, the smell of pitch, the way my father judged wood by touch and not eye because mildew had taken much of his sight by the end. I spoke of my mother, who sang while planing staves and believed saints watched craftsmanship more closely than combat. I spoke of my younger sister, dead before the war of winter fever. I found that once speaking began, I wanted to continue, because in that place, memory was the only ground not yet requisitioned by the ward. Lucerne listened with total attention. That was almost worse than indifference. "And what do you feel now when you recall them?" he asked. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth." I looked at my hand, at the impossible seam where the bite had been. "Less than I should." That too, he wrote down. As the week progressed, the changes moved outward. The skin around the old wound darkened not to bruise purple or necrotic black, but to a deep iron gray under the surface, as though some second structure was being laid beneath my own. Veins along my forearm stood more sharply. My nails hardened. The nail on the thumb of the bitten hand developed a dark crescent at the base that no scrubbing removed. My teeth ached, especially the canines. The pain came in pulses that matched no heartbeat I recognized. Once, while washing, I found the muscles across my shoulders had swollen despite confinement, as if I had been hauling timber all week in my sleep. And always there was the hunger. I asked for meat. They denied it twice, then began including small portions for observation. I know this because Lucerne told me so with no embarrassment whatever. "We are charting appetite specificity," he said. "On me." "Where else?" The first time they gave me beef, salted and stringy, I cried after eating it. Not from disgust. From relief so intense it was almost gratitude. I hated myself for that. I hated them more for noting it. By day 7, the metal had begun to change. Before that day, there had been smaller signs, the kind a sane man argues away because to notice them fully would require too much rearrangement of hope. A spoon left on the tray developed freckles of rust wherever my bitten thumb had rested. The buckle on the wash bucket strap discolored overnight after I steadied it during cleaning. Once, while kneeling under the vent to catch a draft, I found the nail heads in the skirting board came away chalky beneath my fingernails. I told myself the ward was old, damp, poorly maintained. All of that was true. It was also not the point. At first it was only a stain on the basin chain where my fingers rested while I drank. I thought some cleaner had been missed. Then the fixed stool showed reddish tears around the bolts. Then the iron ring at the head of the bed, where my right wrist had rubbed during sleep, flaked under my touch and left black-red grit in my palm. I mentioned it to Ansel, expecting denial. Instead, they made a lesson of it. Lucerne arrived with 3 objects set on a wooden tray: a fresh nail, a sanctified nail wrapped in white thread, and a little rectangle of untreated iron scored with numbered lines. He placed them in front of me one by one while the clerk watched a water clock. "Hold this for 10 breaths," he said. The fresh nail warmed fast and left my fingers tingling. When I set it down, the point had darkened. The sanctified one resisted longer. Not entirely. A bruise-colored smear spread along the shank where skin met metal, but the white thread around its head smoked faintly and did not darken. The rectangle of untreated iron gave the clearest result. By the 6th breath, the numbered lines had begun to blur under a creeping bloom, and by the 10th, There was a visible roughness to the surface, like rot in miniature. "Again," Lucerne said. "No." Ansel stepped forward. I held out my hand before he could strike me. That, perhaps, was the first moment I truly collaborated in my own study. Not from loyalty, from a compulsion to know. The second trial confirmed the first. The third established consistency. Then Lucerne changed variables. Left hand versus right, skin dry versus damp, metal warmed by the stove versus cooled in water, direct touch versus cloth barrier. He was excited, though he would never have used the word. His excitement showed in efficiency. Questions shortened, notes lengthened. Once the clerk dropped a page and Lucerne snapped at him with such venom that both of us stared. He apologized a moment later without looking at either of us. Men reveal themselves most plainly when knowledge is near. Instead, his nostrils flared with interest. "Do it again," he said. "What?" "Touch it." So I did. We both watched. Nothing at first. Then, slowly as breath on glass, a bloom of dark tarnish spread from beneath my fingertips. Ansel called for Lucerne. The two of them stood over the ring with the reverence of priests before a relic. "Localized transference," Lucerne murmured. "Or accelerated decay response," said Ansel. "With or without contact?" Ansel looked at me. "We will test that." That evening they removed the basin and replaced it with a wooden bucket. They changed the bed chains for heavier ones. They repainted the crucifix bolts with fresh sanctified oil. The clerk added a line to the wall notation outside my cell. I read it when the hatch stood open during cleaning. Metal response observed, day 7. Cognition intact, cognition intact. The phrase chilled me worse than any mention of rot. It implied the possibility they expected to lose it. The other patient across from me deteriorated in a different key. I learned his name only because he shouted it during confession through the door. Joran Pell, artillery loader, 9th Basilica Reserve. He had inhaled slurry from a burst Black Grail shell and lasted 10 days longer than forecast, which seemed to disappoint the men studying him only insofar as it complicated their charts. He coughed constantly. Sometimes he laughed between coughs, great barking bursts without humor. Once he asked me if my teeth itched. I did not answer. Once he begged me to tell him whether the ward was still underground because he could no longer remember if his ceiling was stone or sky. On day 8 they took him away. I heard the chains. I heard a litany for the condemned. I heard him suddenly become lucid enough to scream for his mother in a voice so ordinary it tore something in me. Then I smelled oil. Then smoke. No one explained. No one needed to. After Joran, the corridor felt emptier but not quieter. There was a tension in the staff now, a directed expectation. They came more often to my door. Lucerne asked if I still dreamed of my family. Ansel tested my grip strength with spring clamps and noted the bent results without surprise. Sister Malin lingered less. When she did speak, she urged me to pray not for cure, but for discernment. "About what?" I asked. She lowered her voice. "About when a thing inside you stops being you, and whether you will know." That night I did not sleep at all. Instead, I sat with my back to the wall and catalogued what was failing. Memory, still largely sound. Prayer, intermittent. Appetite, worsening. Loyalty, complicated. Fear, active. Shame, active. Pity, diminished but not absent. Mercy toward self, uncertain. If I had been a mechanic inspecting a broken engine, I might have admired the clarity. Men rarely know themselves by categories until some emergency forces the issue. Infection is an emergency of taxonomy. You discover which parts of the soul are structural only when another force starts testing load-bearing beams. Toward midnight, I tried an experiment of my own. I bit the inside of my cheek until blood came, then held it in my mouth without swallowing. I wanted to see whether the taste of my own blood would disgust, tempt, or reassure me. The answer shames me still. It calmed me. Not richly, not with the obscene intensity that the orderly's wounded hand later would, but enough that my shoulders loosened and the ache in the teeth dulled. I spat at once and scrubbed my tongue on the blanket corner until the taste thinned. Yet some part of me filed the lesson away. That secret bookkeeping was perhaps the clearest sign I had already moved closer to danger than I admitted aloud. I sat on the cot and listened to the ward breathe around me, boots on stone, distant murmurs, water sloshing in buckets, the creak of hinges from farther corridors where other doors opened and closed. For the first time, I realized I could identify who approached by more than sound. There was warmth to them. Not heat on the skin like standing near a lamp, but an inward pressure, a living density in the dark. Sister Malin moved softly and carried weariness. Ansel's gait came with sharp, impatient bursts of energy. Lucerne seemed cooler than the others until he came near, then suddenly concentrated, as if whatever burned in him was banked deep. I lay there mapping them through walls with a certainty that ought not to have existed, and with that certainty came appetite, not desire in the ordinary sense, not anger either, a command, a pull, the knowledge that if the door opened and a throat presented itself near enough, my body would know what to do before my soul could object. I bit my own forearm hard enough to bruise through skin just to have another pain to hold. In the morning, the bruise had vanished. I asked for execution that afternoon. Lucerne received the request without visible emotion. On what grounds? I stared at him through the open hatch. I can feel you outside the door. I know where your veins are. Isn't that enough? He considered. Not yet. Not yet? Your speech is coherent. Your memory remains stable. Your devotional responses are diminished but present. You distinguish desire from action. That is not yet the point of terminal intervention. I laughed then, because the alternative was to beg. So I'm still useful. His silence admitted too much. It was after that conversation that I began truly to hate him. Hate had been absent before, replaced by fear, shame, and resentment. Hate was cleaner. It sharpened me. I lay in the cell and thought of his throat, the neat artery beating beneath parchment skin. I thought of Ansel's blunt fingers prying at my hand. I thought of the clerk scratching notes while I spoke of my mother as if sorrow were a specimen. The thoughts came with such ease that I recoiled from them, yet recoil weakened daily. There were moments when my outrage at the ward's betrayal and my hunger for its inhabitants felt like the same emotion wearing two masks. On day 10, they brought in a castigator. By then, the ward staff had begun changing around me in small but telling ways. Hatches were opened less widely, food trays were pushed through on longer boards. The younger clerks no longer tried to look detached. They looked at me with the wounded fascination people reserve for a battlefield relic too terrible to throw away. One guard had started wearing a strip of relic cloth around his throat when posted near my corridor. Another refused assignment there outright and was gone after an argument I heard only in fragments. Even Sister Malin's kindness altered. She still said my name, still set the bowl carefully, but there was a strain in her shoulders now, as if each ordinary gesture had become a wager against the possibility that I might lunge at the slot. I had not lunged. That shamed me most. I wanted to, more often than I admitted, but wanting and doing still seemed separate enough that I could imagine myself morally intact. Such self-deceptions are precious luxuries. The ward was stripping them from me one at a time. You know the type of man I mean, even if you have never stood near one. Not simply a military priest, though they are that. Not simply executioner either, though no one mistakes the office. Castigators carry in their posture the belief that violence becomes clean when sanctioned enough. This one wore blackened plate over a soot-gray habit, with a sensor canister at the hip and burn scars climbing the side of his neck into the shaved line of his scalp. He gave his name as Castigator Marius Valek. I knew the surname. Men at the line had spoken of him before, always with that mix of admiration and fear reserved for holy professionals who solve problems by setting them on fire. He entered my cell with Lucerne and Ansel present, which in itself felt like theater. Valek looked first not at me, but at the corroded bed ring, the bolt heads blackened around the stool, the pitted hinge plate inside the door. Only then did he look at my face. "How long since exposure?" he asked. 10 days, Lucerne said, and still coherent. Yes. Valak's eyes moved over me as a butcher measures carcass weight. Remarkable. I asked to be purged, I said. He turned to me with no malice at all. Many ask for many things in this wing. And we are not governed by appetite, yours or mine. Then he took one step closer and held something up before my face, a small relic cruciform case plated in silver. I felt a hiss of revulsion so sudden my shoulders jerked back before I understood it. Not pain exactly, more a deep internal nausea, as if some second set of organs objected to the sight. Valak noticed everything. Useful, he said. The words settled in the cell like ash. After he left, I understood the ward differently, not as a medical failure nor as an exceptionally cruel quarantine, but as a workshop. Whatever they feared in the Black Grail, they also studied what it made. They wanted thresholds, signs, durations, reactions to relics, to iron, to appetite, to restraint. Not in hope of saving men like me, though they would have said otherwise if asked in public. They wanted to know when an infected soldier stopped being salvageable. They wanted to know whether certain abilities emerged before that point. They wanted knowledge fit for screening, and perhaps for harsher purposes besides. No revelation in war should surprise a grown man very much. Even so, I felt then a childish grief. New Antioch had always demanded much from its soldiers. Blood, obedience, toil, teeth clenched through mud and shellfire and sermons. But below St. Alban, they had found another thing to demand, that a man serve even after his body had become an argument against his continued existence. The ward changed after Valak's visit. Restraints came sooner. Interviews lengthened. They brought in items for reaction tests, iron nails, relic ash, incense, a communion wafer, beef blood in stoppered glass, grave soil from consecrated ground, and a strip of cloth reportedly recovered from a Black Grail banner. Some things moved me not at all. Some drew nausea. Some triggered hunger so sudden I shook. The banner cloth made the bitten hand twitch before my mind had formed intention. Lucerne saw that and wrote until the nib split. It was during these tests that I understood the split opening inside me. One self still judged, recoiled, and named corruption. Another sorted the room without words. Warmth, weakness, edible, dangerous, holy, obstructive, openable. When Lucerne uncorked the vial of beef blood, my human mind registered disgust at the theatricality. The lower thing registered volume, temperature, distance, and how quickly the glass might break against stone. That was the worst horror of the ward, not pain, not hunger. The discovery that conscience could be forced to share a house with another tenant and made to watch that tenant learn the floor plan. Lucerne, of course, wanted language for it. "When the urge arises," he asked one afternoon, seated just beyond the threshold with the hatch open and 2 guards at his back, "does it feel like compulsion, persuasion, or identity?" "What sort of question is that?" "The sort that remains useful after you're dead." I laughed tiredly. "Then a precise answer. It feels like being outnumbered in my own skull." He considered that with grave attention, as if I had offered a useful engineering note. "And who is winning?" he asked. I might have lied. I did not. "Depends how close you stand." After that, he kept greater distance. I stopped answering many questions after that. Silence earned beatings from Ansel, but he was careful never to damage me much. Damage, I realized, had become inconvenient. My body repaired too quickly for ordinary punishment to mean anything. The swelling from a strike faded in hours. A split lip closed by morning. Once, in a surge of disgust, I drove my own thumbnail deep into the seam on my hand, hoping to tear it open and prove there was still ordinary meat beneath. The flesh yielded black-red fluid for perhaps 3 breaths, then sealed around the wound and trapped the blood under a glossy film. I stared at it, and for the first time understood that whatever had entered me did not merely resist death. It revised injury into instruction. My prayers became difficult. Not impossible, which would have been simpler, but jagged. I could begin familiar words and lose them halfway to an urge to bite through my own tongue. Names of saints arrived late, or with the wrong faces attached. The crucifix above the bed remained recognizable as holy, yet more and more my attention fixed not on the figure of the suffering Christ, but on the iron bolts holding the piece to stone, and how easily they might be loosened if left under my touch long enough. That was when I asked Sister Malin whether the others had ever stayed aware to the end. She froze with the tray half through the slot. "Why would you ask?" "Because I am still here." Her eyes filled so quickly it frightened me more than anger would have. She recovered before the tears fell. "Awareness is not mercy, Corin." "No," I said, "but I'd like to know if it can last." She looked down the corridor before speaking, and when she did, her voice was barely above breath. "Longer than anyone wanted once." "What happened?" "Castigators happened." She withdrew the tray too quickly, broth slopping over the rim, and left me with that. "Longer than anyone wanted." That sentence sat with me for days. I began measuring myself against it. Was I longer? Would I be? Was there, somewhere in the books beyond my cell, a line I had already crossed that placed me not among the doomed, but among the significant cases? Pride and terror are foul companions, but they often travel together. I despise the part of me that wondered whether I was becoming exceptional. On day 12, the first piece of the door latch came away in my hand. The day had been unusually quiet. No screaming from the lower corridor, no new arrivals, fewer boots than normal. Through the vent I smelled fresh lime and old smoke, meaning some chamber nearby had been burned out and whitewashed. Silence in such places never means safety. It means preparation completed elsewhere. Lucerne had visited early and, perhaps from fatigue, let more truth show than usual. He asked whether contamination could ever be turned against its source. If certain traits emerged before madness, could they be recognized in the field quickly enough to prevent catastrophe? Could a chaplain or surgeon distinguish a doomed man from a temporarily useful one? He said it all with the abstraction of a lecturer discussing bridge loads, but underneath I heard the live wire of intent, not cure, use. "You are not preserving us," I told him. "You are inventorying us." He met my gaze calmly. "Cities are preserved by inventories. Men are not. There are sentences a man hears once and never forgives. That was one. I had not been trying to break the hatch. I was standing there after evening prayers, forehead resting against the wood, drawing in the scents beyond, when my fingers curled around the inner lip of the iron shutter. The metal felt thin and soft as old biscuit. A little pressure, a twist, and a fragment came away with a dry crunch. I looked at the rust in my palm and felt something answer inside me. Not joy, recognition. After that, I tested the cell in secret. The bed frame shed black grit where my shins brushed it. The chain ring under the cot pitted deeper by the hour. The hinge screws on the bucket bracket loosened enough to wobble. I should have reported it. Some loyal, terrified part of me thought I still might, but the larger part wanted the ward breached. The staff grew more cautious. Fewer entered alone. More prayers were spoken before the hatch opened. Valek returned twice with assistants carrying flame equipment wrapped in oilcloth. He asked concise questions. Did I recognize my own face? Did I dream of altars? Did I experience revulsion toward bells? Could I smell the difference between men and women? I answered some because defiance no longer felt like defiance if they expected it. I lied where I could. By day 14, I could hear pulses, though hearing is not the right word. The ward had become a map of throbs and temperatures. Rats in the walls, a pigeon overhead in some crack of the upper masonry. Most terrible of all, the humans sorted themselves into patterns. Malin steady and tired. Ansel hard and abrupt. Valek restrained like a furnace banked behind an iron door. Lucerne was worst. His rhythm changed not with danger but with novelty. If a symptom repeated, he cooled. If something new appeared, he quickened. I came to know his curiosity as a living beat. With that came certainty that if the cell opened, I would go for Lucerne first. I still think there was justice in that. That is how far gone I was. The incident came during second evening round. A junior orderly, new to the ward by his smell and uncertainty, brought the meal tray while Sister Malin stood behind him checking the checklist. I was seated on the cot, wrists bound. The hatch opened. Broth, beef, bread. He pushed the tray too far and his sleeve brushed the corroded shutter edge. The metal gave way. More than gave. It sloughed apart with a sound like dry bark crushed under heel. The hatch dropped inward. The boy jerked back. Instinctively, he caught at the tray. Broth splashed across his hand. He cursed. The smell hit me. Not the broth. The skin under it. Hot and alive, suddenly close enough that every rotten law in my remade flesh woke at once. My restraints snapped so easily I did not at first understand they had snapped. One moment I was seated. The next I was at the door with my shoulder against the wood, my bitten hand through the opening, fingers around the orderly's wrist. He screamed. Sister Malin shouted my name. I remember that clearly. My name, not my rank, not subject, not containment breach. Tomas. Then hunger took the reins. I dragged. The wood groaned. The outer chain held for perhaps 1 second, perhaps less. Corrosion had already weakened the mounting plate. When I heaved again, it tore from the stone in a burst of dust and red-black fragments. The door came inward enough for me to see the corridor lamp, the orderly's face gone white, Malin reaching for the alarm pole. I think I meant to kill him first. I think so. But meaning had become an ornament on action. My mouth opened. My teeth struck leather sleeve, cloth, skin. Blood came hot over my tongue, and with it a revelation so obscene I nearly went mad in that instant. Not merely pleasure, but rightness. The body I wore believed utterly in what it was doing. Malin yanked the alarm chain. Bells erupted through the ward. The orderly shrieked and stumbled free, leaving skin and cloth behind. I forced the door wider. Iron straps split from punked wood. The corridor smelled suddenly full of life, a cathedral of it, and every pulse in range tolled in me like bells calling to slaughter. I saw Malin backing away, rosary in hand, and some last human splinter of me flared hard enough to wrench my body sideways instead of at her throat. That hesitation saved her. It doomed the next man. Ansel rounded the far corner with 2 guards. He took in the shattered door, the blood on my mouth, the posture of my body, and to his credit understood at once. He did not call for restraint. He shouted, "Flame!" and brought up the iron-bound case he carried for examinations as if to ward me off. I hit him before he could open it. I remember the impact, the astonishing ease of it. He had hit me before, cut me, handled me. I had thought of him as solid. He was not solid at all. He broke across the wall and slid down, leaving a wet smear. One guard drove a spear into my side. I felt the entry, the pressure, the scrape against rib. Pain arrived from far away. I ripped the shaft free, and with it came so much blood that any man should have staggered. I did not stagger. The wound tightened around itself even as the guard watched. He dropped the spear. That fear in him was intoxicating. The corridor became confusion, bells, smoke, prayers half-shouted, boots pounding on stone. I slammed one guard against the opposite cell until his helmet rang like struck metal. The other got an arm around my neck and would have died for it had Malin not hurled a lamp between us. Oil splashed over the floor, flaring at once. Fire licked my trouser leg. For one strange second, the heat soothed rather than hurt. Then some deeper layer of altered flesh recoiled, and I bellowed so loudly the vault overhead answered. Whatever human will remained in me had been pushed to a narrow inner gallery. The larger thing wanted blood, warmth, rupture. Doors hid people, stone hid meat, iron offended, fire threatened. The world had become terribly simple. I went for Lucerne. He was at the corridor junction with 2 clerks dragging equipment cases out of the way. Even then, he did not look frightened enough. Focused, yes. Pale, certainly. But still assessing, still learning. That steadied my hatred into a point. I crashed through the first case, sending glass and metal scattering. Something inside it hissed where it struck my legs. Lucerne raised a silvered relic spray and flung burning droplets across my face. The liquid smoked on contact. My vision flared white. I hit him blind, and we went down together. At that distance, I could smell his blood beneath skin. Thin, fast, disciplined. My hand closed on his throat. His eyes met mine, not with pity, not even with fear, but with professional recognition. "Hold him," he rasped to the clerks. "I need one more response." That enraged me beyond language. I squeezed. Cartilage shifted. One clerk slammed a sensor chain across the back of my skull. Another drove a blessed spike into my shoulder. I tore it free and turned, ready to tear through them both. Then the corridor filled with the hard, rushing cough of pressure-fed flame. Castigator Valak had come. He stood at the far bend in fireproof vestments, visor down. Two assistants braced behind him with canisters and hoses. The nozzle in his hands tracked me with pitiless steadiness. "By authority vested in the cleansing office," he said, voice amplified behind metal. "Subject in cell 4 is judged terminal and forfeit." Lucerne, half crushed beneath me, tried to speak. Valak ignored him. When I smelled the fuel, relief hit the human part of me so hard I almost wept, not because burning would be easy, only because it would end. Then the hunger felt it too and panicked. I launched forward. Valak triggered the stream. Fire in a confined corridor is not the clean torch of ceremony. It is impact, liquid light, a wall that strikes before the mind names it. The first burst caught my chest and left arm and turned the world into roaring brightness. My altered flesh, so indifferent to blade and puncture, understood flame at once. I smelled my own fat. I heard sounds from my throat no saint should have recorded. Still, I kept moving. 3 steps, no more. On the second, my right hand brushed the wall and left a black streak where the lime wash blistered. On the third, my left leg failed at the knee, flesh splitting open to show black-red cords and wet, pale growth like roots forcing through meat. I fell hard enough to crack teeth on stone. The flame kept coming in controlled bursts. Valak knew his trade. He did not flood the corridor and risk the tanks. He pulsed it, herded it, kept me alight where I writhed. Somewhere Malin was praying. Somewhere Ansel was coughing blood. Somewhere Lucerne, if alive, was still trying to witness. I burned and thought of the Cooper's yard. Do not ask me why. Perhaps because the brain flees toward first things when ending comes. I saw my father's hands black with pitch. I saw steam rising from bent staves. I saw iron hoops heated red before fitting. I heard my mother singing under her breath, a hymn to Saint Adela of honest labor. For one impossible instant the hunger fell away, and I understood with perfect sorrow how very small and ordinary my life had been before war made me material. That was the last clean thought. After it, there was only pain, and under the pain one final impulse to crawl, not toward prey, not toward escape, but toward the fire itself, to let it finish the argument. I dragged once. Valak stepped closer and directed the stream into my open mouth. The world ended in white. I know what happened after only because the dying do not always depart as cleanly as doctrine promises, and because men talk freely over remains they no longer consider listening. I heard boots circling the charred thing that had been me. I heard Valak order a secondary burn on the cell and corridor. I heard Ansel, voice broken and wet, say that the subject had displayed advanced adaptive resilience, environmental corrosion effects, appetite specificity, and preserved cognition to breach point. He sounded proud despite himself. Then Lucerne spoke, or tried to. His voice was ragged, crushed around the words. "All notes," he whispered. "Copied, sealed, sent to Central Review." Valak replied, "You nearly died for a file." Lucerne coughed. "Then let it not be wasted." There was a pause. I imagined the castigator looking down at what remained of me, smoke rising in strips from blackened ribs and fused iron. Then he said the line that stayed with me longest in whatever dark threshold followed. Mercy was due him days ago. Instruction kept him. No one answered that. Perhaps no one wished to. If there is any worth in telling this now, it lies there. Not in the appetite, nor in the altered flesh, nor even in the Black Grail's patient obscenity. The enemy corrupts what it touches, everyone knows that. What I learned beneath St. Alban was worse. Men can be corrupted by the study of corruption and still call themselves pure. They can watch a soul blackened by measured increments, delay mercy in the name of vigilance, and write the whole thing neatly into ledgers for future use. Burn the dead when you are told, salt the wounds, distrust the kindly examiner who says he means to preserve you. And if ever you are taken below a Lazar House under seal, pray that the castigator on duty is a merciful man, and the scholar beside him an impatient one. I was not granted either.